Hello everyone, thank you for joining. Henry Kissinger once said, "Control the food and you control the people. Control the energy and you control the continents. Control the money and you control the world." Now more than ever before, this statement rings true. Due to increasing militarization and arguably a complete lack of competent diplomacy, every day we hear about yet another escalation. And now that the Biden administration is likely going to approve sending U.S. military contractors to Ukraine, officially, we know that they've been there for a while, but now that it's about to be official, it seems that we're on a straight path to a major, truly major global conflict. This is a good time for people to start waking up to the reality. In one way or another, escalations in the Middle East and in Europe will send shockwaves through the rest of the world. Human security will be impacted everywhere, and the supply of food will be at a great risk because exporters of commodities such as grains, oils, and other staples in our diet, they will likely move to increase their own reserves to make sure that they have enough for their own people, for their own population. This will further limit their exports, causing a surge in commodity prices worldwide. In turn, the poorest nations might face famine as they're unable to secure adequate imports of basic food items such as grains. Financial Times just published an article that underscores we can no longer rely on the supply of food being uninterrupted. I realize that it sounds nearly impossible for many of us, and if this is not a red flag, I'm not sure what is. Take a look here. Financial Times says, "World headed for food wars," warns major commodities trader. It goes on to explain, the world is headed for food wars as geopolitical tensions and climate change push countries into conflict over waning supplies. They're already telling you supplies of food are waning. And this is according to one of the world's largest agricultural commodity trader. Speaking at the Redburn Atlantic, and should we be surprised at this point, none other than Rothschild Consumer Conference last week, Varghese, who is the chief executive at Olam Agri, which is an agricultural trading house, he warned that trade barriers imposed by governments seeking to shore up domestic food stocks had exacerbated food inflation. What does he really mean by this? Well, he's telling us that countries around the world have been increasing their domestic supplies of food. And why would that be? Well, because all signs point to further escalations, an increase in refugee crisis, which means more vulnerable individuals around the world will be in need of assistance with basic necessities. And therefore, it means we will face further degradation of global stability. This has resulted in less inventory that is available for exports, and therefore food prices rose around the world. This is what happened, and it's only fair to expect that this trend will continue. Now, small farmers and agricultural businesses in general in the United States and in Europe really need to prepare for difficult times. Russia is the biggest producer of agricultural fertilizer, and up until this point, the United States and Europe have been purchasing billions of dollars worth of Russian fertilizer. However, even though Russia wants to continue exporting its fertilizer, wants to continue trading with Western partners are about to make a big change. For example, in 2023, the United States purchased nearly $1.5 billion worth of fertilizer from Russia. However, that is about to stop, and that's going to become a massive hit to domestic food production in the United States and in Europe. Remember, at this point, nothing should be dismissed as a coincidence. New sanctions will soon impact fertilizer imports. At a time when the EU is working on decoupling, so the EU and the United States are working on decoupling their economies from Russia. The figures are startling, says this article. Since the 2020-2021 agricultural season, EU imports of Russian fertilizer have doubled. Russia now accounts for around a third of the EU's total imports. France imports 80% of its fertilizer needs from Russia. Both the EU and the United States are trying to wage this blame game to justify their own lack of competence. You may recall that a couple of months ago, State Secretary Antony Blinken and then Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen went to China, and while they were in China, they blamed China for being able to manufacture too much, for its overcapacity, a term that really doesn't exist. Well, now the desperate blame game continues, and this time around, Russia is to blame because Europe wants to buy its fertilizer. As EU farmers' dependence on Russian fertilizers has grown, the state of our domestic fertilizer industry has suffered from the impact of cheap imports. Around 20% of EU fertilizer capacity is currently lying idle because of a lack of demand, as cheaper Russian fertilizer has replaced fertilizers made in the EU. Russian exporters have priced their products in a very targeted way, so they're telling you that they're not really in favor of market economy, so they're slightly but consistently cheaper than the EU's production costs. The European fertilizers industry calls on the EU to take the strongest possible action to stop Russia using fertilizer exports as a weapon. You just can't make that up. At the expense of farmers, and we all remember those massive, truly massive farmer protests against Agenda 2030 that took place several months ago. So at the expense of farmers, at the expense of their livelihoods, and ultimately at the expense of food and therefore human security of many nations, the next move will kneecap food security globally. And make no mistake about these new sanctions, it is a choice. The initiative to stop importing fertilizer from Russia is ramping up. Here's Bloomberg, for example, a major news outlet, telling you Europe's fertilizer producers sound alarm over big imports from Russia. A lobby group, Fertilizers Europe, and you have to wonder who's running this lobby group, right? It says that imports of Russian fertilizer undermine efforts to restart capacity that was idled by the energy crisis of their own creation, while also raising a food security risk for the continent. There's a lot to unpack here. Not only is Europe unable to function as it used to without cost-effective natural resources from Russia, but also they're trying to tell you here, they're trying to convince you that you now have to say no to food security because they want to revive their domestic production, which they neglected, the production of fertilizer. And of course, you can't do that. You can't revive manufacturing and industrial production without cheap energy. So, the same energy that they just banned. I hope that you can see what's going on here and the level of hypocrisy. The cost of living crisis is about to go through the roof if the price of basic food items rises even more. Developing countries, especially those in the Middle East and in Africa, they will be hit the hardest with extreme food shortages because the supply of food is about to decrease as the demand for it continues to rise. Thank you for watching this video. Thanks for joining me. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share the video if you found it interesting. Make sure that you follow me on my social platforms. Make sure that you have backups, and you'll find all of my social platforms linked in the description below. I would love to see you there. And we'll meet again on YouTube or on Rumble tomorrow. Bye for now.